great honor to be here with the Honorable Kevin Rudd. We will talk about U.S. China relations. We will talk about China under President Xi Jinping. We'll talk about China, Europe, and Switzerland relations. The format will be as follows. We will have a discussion for about an hour here among two of us, and then we have ample time planned for questions from the audience in the end. So Kevin, I'd like to start with a topic that's on everyone's mind, which is the trade war between the US and China. Now, less than a year ago, whenever I talk to a business person in Switzerland or anywhere else and ask them whether they fear a trade war between those two nations, they said no, because it's in no one's interest. It's just bark, but no one will do anything. And yet, today, we are in this situation. So, to start with, what happened there? What went wrong between those two nations?
Well, thank you, Mark, and it's good to be back here in Zurich. I've been here many times over the years, and thank you, Adrian, for that warm introduction on behalf of the Asia Society here in Zurich. Our Zurich Centre is one part of the Asia Society family, of which we have 13 centres around the world. I come from the mothership in New York, even though I'm not an American. So I'm their first non-American running the show, and they're still suffering from culture shock. So, not least because of my version of English, but we try. On the question of the Americans and the Chinese and how this, let's call it trade war, came about, in the United States, I mean, things have been brewing for quite a long time. First of all, you have what I describe as the National Security Policy Establishment, led by Pacific Command, now Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, who on a daily basis find themselves up against either the Chinese Navy or the Air Force, either in the South China Sea or, let's call it more broadly, in the Western Pacific. So there has been a growing, over a decade plus, level of concern about China's military capabilities and China's strategic intentions. And that's been across Pentagon, the armed forces, and a large part of the intelligence community. But despite all that, historically, the ballast in the relationship has been the business community, which have said, yep, we understand that China represents a military challenge in East Asia and the West Pacific, but there's a bucket load of money to be made there, so let's keep it all under control. And so what's happened is that constituency has itself changed its mind. And for a range of reasons, a number of people exporting into the Chinese market have found there to be non-tariff barriers of growing orders of difficulty and complexity if you're selling into the Chinese market. Or if product is sold in, then there is a parallel problem which emerges in terms of proper protection of intellectual property. For those investing into the Chinese market, they have found that the restrictions behind the border are significant, and the conditions for the investment often change once you are there. And then, more recently, conditionalities in investment agreements, which have given rise to what the Americans would describe as forced technology transfer. And more recently, again, you have the high-tech sector beginning to react against what they see as China's national high technology strategy, which you see outlined in what's called the China 2025 or Made in China 2025 strategy. And it says that in all major new categories of high technology, starting with artificial intelligence, but moving through the spectrum and naming them, China says that domestically and then globally it intends to dominate these markets, dominate them by 2030. So bit by bit, the American business community has gone from, isn't this a great opportunity, into this is a pain in the derriere, through to now we have a major challenge and threat on our hands. So the historical support from the business community in the United States has crumbled. And then the final bit in the equation has been, let's call it the human rights constituency, which has been long sceptical of China. But because of a tightening of political control under Xi Jinping's regime, and in particular Xi Jinping's decision from March of this year to have unlimited presidential terms, put all these things together and you've got the structural factors at work for a deterioration. Then enter Donald Trump. And Donald, as we know, is not a leading intellectual force. But Donald has, a basic sort of political instinct. And his campaign was, all you people out there from Trumpland, which is what it now is, the reason you have either lost your jobs or the reason you may lose your jobs or because you are doing badly while all the globalists are doing fine is because of a conspiracy between Wall Street on the one hand and China on the other. And I'm going to get them. I'm going to reduce the trade deficit and we're going to have a major campaign against China's unfair trade and economic practices. So what he has done is basically galvanized all these other structural factors which are at work into a unifying political campaign. And to China's great surprise, and to some of the international community's surprise, he then proceeded to do it as of this year.
But basically you are saying these are structural shifts. There's a deep structural shift going on. You said we've had 40 years of strategic engagement. Now we get into a world of strategic competition. So this is not because of Trump. Trump has just seen the signs and politicized upon it.
Yeah, the Trump has has seen these structural factors at work and added his own piece of alchemy in a very potent mix. And that's where we are at the moment. And when you spoke before about the shift from, let's call it strategic engagement to strategic competition, that's not my words. If you read the National Security Strategy of the United States of December 2017, the National Defense Strategy of the United States as of January 18, and subsequent documents, including Vice President Pence's elaborate speech on China about 6 weeks ago on behalf of the administration, they all formally define the end of engagement and formally say we, after 40 years, are beginning a period of strategic competition. For the rest of us, it raises a fundamental question, particularly those of us who are allies of the United States who happen to be in the Pacific as well, which is, so if you're going to do this, what are the rules of this new strategic competition? Or are we now, after 40 years, in an environment where there are no rules?
Now, especially after that speech of Vice President Mike Pence at the Hudson Institute, the word Cold War has entered into the vocabulary again. There were quite many commentators that said this is the beginning of a new Cold War between the US and China. Would you agree to that?
No, I don't. I think that's just lazy commentary because it requires intellectual effort to think of something more complex than that. Those of us who are old enough remember what a Cold War used to look like. When I joined the Australian Foreign Service, we were still in a Cold War. And the guys on the other side of the Cold War, they were called the Soviet Union. They spoke Russian. And they had these characteristics. One, they had an entire arsenal of ICBMs, the same size as the American arsenal, committed to a doctrine of mutually assured destruction in both directions. Number two, there was no economic engagement between the Soviet Union and the United States. Three, there was no people-to-people contact other than the exchange of spies between the two countries. And then on top of that, there were about 20 proxy wars being fought between the Soviets and the Americans in the Third World. Now, none of those characteristics describe what we currently have with the U.S. China relationship, despite its stresses. So we are into a new world, but it's just lazy journalism and irresponsible commentary to now label it as a Cold War. It could end up there if we're not terribly careful about how things go, but it's just wrong technically, and I think dangerous politically to simply proclaim it. I'm always wary in politics of things called self-fulfilling prophecies, that if you use extravagant language, then the behaviours follow the language rather than the language describing the behaviour.
But we are in a trade war right now.
Well, conflict, it's not a full war yet. Yeah.
And it will actually accelerate come January 2019.
Machine guns, not full artillery at this stage.
Exactly. Who has more stamina to keep standing in that fight?
Well, objectively, you would say, on balance, the Americans, for a simple question of mathematics. China is more trade exposed as an economy. 40% plus of Chinese GDP comes from the traded sector of its economy. In the case of the United States, about 29%. Secondly, China's a $12 trillion economy with $500 billion worth of exports going to the United States. The Americans are a $20 trillion economy with $130 billion worth of exports to China. So on the pure mathematics, there's an answer. More importantly, in perception, the United States, and it's in Pence's interview today, published on Air Force 2, as it takes him to the summit of the East Asian Summit in Singapore, before going on to the APEC Summit in Port Moresby. Pence says, we are more robustly capable of enduring a long economic, a long trade war with the Chinese. And I think that's the self-perception when we go in our think tank capacity to Washington, which we do quite often. That is the internal perception of the Americans. On the Chinese perception, they've engaged now in a new language of we've swallowed bitter pills in the past, and we can do it again. Xi Jinping now talks unusually about a new period of Dittli, which is self-reliance, which is terminology I haven't heard since the days of the Cultural Revolution, and a view that, okay, you want to give us a hard time, we've been through hard times before, we can do it again. So, but I think the reality of the Chinese mind is that significant damage can be done to China now by the Americans. So I think the appetite in Beijing for a deal is strong. The open question is, how big is the appetite in Washington?
Do you see a possibility of a deal that lets Donald Trump walk away with declaring victory, while at the same time President Xi Jinping not losing face?
Well, if Donald Trump could walk away from the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, waving 4 paragraphs and declaring victory in the end of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, he can do anything, because nothing, repeat, nothing has materially happened in North Korea. There's the same number of nuclear weapons, 40 to 50, exist in North Korea. The same number of missiles, short, medium and long range, exist in North Korea. But because the Donald said that he'd had a victory and that nuclear weapons were now a thing of the past in North Korea, means his ability in his own mind to sell anything as a political win is formidable. And given he has a compliant media in the United States in terms of Fox, owned by my compatriot Rupert Murdoch, to broadcast whatever message he wants and declare victory, and because his supporter base is not entirely critical, then his ability to sell an outcome as a win is great. So what could he sell as a win? He could sell as a win a Chinese commitment to radically narrow the trade deficit, currently running at about $370 billion a year, by a couple of $100 billion, maybe over a couple of years. Because that, at the end of the day, was his core commitment to his constituency prior to last presidential election. The tricky bit is the elements of the American ask which go beyond the simple manipulation down of the size of the trade deficit. The elements concerning substantive IP protection, the elements concerning forced technology transfer, the elements concerning other non-tariff barriers, the elements concerning other restrictions on investment, and most particularly the elements related to the China Made in 2025 national high technology strategy. So what might be a deal if the Donald wanted one? A number on the trade deficit. I can just see Donald saying this. It's going to come down $200 billion in 2 years. And the rest of it, we're going to have a joint committee with a time limit to resolve this within 6 or 12 months' time. Now, I can see Trump, depending on other factors bearing down on his mind politically, as possibly being able to sell that. But within his White House, there is such a vast array of different views as to what is acceptable that it would depend on which of those views prevailed on the day he gets to Buenos Aires at the end of this month.
Now, looking into the somewhat longer-term future, the relationship between U.S. and China, you wrote that we might be looking at a future of mutually assured misperception. Sort of those two superpowers are constantly not reading the other one properly, or really having misperceptions about the other one's intention. In Beijing today, how do they see sort of the long-term game plan of Washington towards China?
Well, where Trump has succeeded is he's succeeded in completely baffling the Chinese. The Chinese are used to handling American presidents from Nixon to the present. They've seen them come and they've seen them go. They've seen presidents threaten all hell, mayhem and destruction in their presidential election campaigns to then turn into tame, cuddly pussycats once they're in office. And so there is a Chinese, as it were, handbook for handling US presidents. And are we on to Chapter 3, Model 4, or Chapter 2, Model 6? It's like buying a car. But to be fair to Trump, he stands right outside the comfort zones of the handbook. Like, we ain't seen one like this before. This is kind of like, a Cadillac and a Chevy and a Volkswagen mixed together. It's just, it's right outside our normal range of experience. What China's strategic culture loathes and detests most is unpredictability. They don't mind so much if we have radically different positions as external interlocutors of China. What they have a real problem with is unpredictability from today to next week, to next month, to next year. Well, welcome to the psychic world of Donald Trump, because that's what it's like. He just changes. He turns on a dime. You don't have to be the president of China to have that experience. Try being a member of his staff. You'd have that experience every day. So where Trump represents a new challenge for Chinese strategic thinking is they do not know which way he will jump. Now, Trump would say in his defense, that's his notion of the art of the deal. Keep the other side permanently guessing as to what your landing point is, and then surprise them with what it is, having maximised your negotiation position on the way through. Now, that might work in the world of golf courses. I'm not sure it works with another nuclear weapons state, but that nonetheless is how he's approaching this. I think the other thing that at a deeper level, however, which worries the Chinese much more than the political personality of Donald Trump and the political psychology of Donald Trump, is where they have concluded, I think legitimately, this structural ground shift in American politics and policy and economics towards China. And that is, if you go around Capitol Hill these days, as we do again in our think tank capacity, and speak to congressmen and senators, they often will say this: China, that's the only thing we can agree on in this entire building, Republicans and Democrats. So across the congressional divide, across the business community, most, in fact, all agencies of the US administration, Pentagon, state now, traditionally more accommodating of doing business with China, and certainly now commerce, as well as the intelligence community, and the human rights constituency, what worries the Chinese most is that Trump has actually crystallized this much deeper structural shift. So that if we do end up with a Democrat administration after the next presidentials, then the Chinese, I think, are beginning to conclude that this structural shift will continue into the future. What we still do not know, however, is how this doctrinal shift by Trump from engagement to competition, ending perhaps in a form of confrontation, how that will actually be operationalized beyond what we've already seen in terms of the trade war.
Now, we don't only have a special person in the White House, but also in Beijing, in the person of Xi Jinping, the most powerful party secretary since at least Deng Xiaoping. Now, the economy in the past couple of quarters, the Chinese economy has deteriorated. We are down to less than 6.5% now in terms of GDP growth. To what extent is the domestic economy becoming a problem for Xi Jinping?
My own judgment is that it's Xi Jinping's greatest vulnerability at present. That's not a fashionable thing to say, but that's kind of my analytical view. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is we actually at present don't know what the real growth rate is. When things get really bad in the growth rate, shall I say, Chinese statistical claims can border on the creative. But let me tell you what we pick up moving around the country. And I've spent a fair bit of time in China during the course of the Northern Summer. Is Xi Jinping has, for political reasons, slowed the pace of market-based reforms in the economy. That process of slowing has been underway for about 3 years now. China had, and those of you from the financial community may remember this, a minor financial meltdown in August of 2015 when their own equities market collapsed and there was a run on their financial institutions. Xi Jinping's reaction to that was one of fury, and that his economic regulators could have allowed this to happen. And as a result, the prosecution of the market reform blueprint slowed down a lot, deliberately, for political reasons, which is, I'm not going to lose political control of this operation by yielding more and more space to the market, whether it's in terms of financial markets or product markets or other markets. Second factor is China, partly because of its interventions at the time of the global financial crisis, but loose credit policies since, has accumulated a phenomenal debt-to-GDP ratio, 280% of GDP. Now that's right up there at Japanese levels and slightly above. And so they've begun, deliberately, I think, for good macro-financial management reasons, a deleveraging campaign over the last couple of years. The problem is in the execution of it, it has really hit hard the private sector, probably disproportionately, as the financial institutions are state-owned and state-owned enterprises have been preferenced over private firms in the deleveraging campaign. So less economic activity coming. Third factor, the ultimate wash-through effect of the... there are some chairs up the front here. Please come on through. It's okay. I don't mind. I'm used to Australian political meetings. This is very sober by comparison. Up here, please take a seat. The third reason is the Chinese have been prosecuting an anti-corruption campaign for 5 years now. But the wash-through effect of that is it's far safer if you are a local decision maker by representing the party or the government not to approve a project going forward if it's any possibility of it backfiring on you personally or being used by your political advocacies to say that you or your great-aunt Nellie once got a free trip to Hong Kong as a result of this deal. And so that's slowing down the pace of activity as well. One other factor I should mention is, as part of the slowdown in the reform program because of the events of 2015, state-owned enterprises have had a new lease of life. And so private firms are now very cautious, not just about deleveraging and impact on them, but state-owned enterprises having more market space now than before, and some state enterprises putting in bids to actually buy successful private firms, often at, shall I say, highly competitive rates. This means that there is something of an emerging crisis of business confidence amongst the Chinese private entrepreneurial class. This is what I sense and feel as I travel in the country. All this predates a further impact from the U.S. China trade war, which is more recent. Put all those together, I'm not sure what the real growth rate is right now. But when I look at the highly concerned statements from Xi Jinping and Vice Premier for the Economy Liu He in the last month, saying to the Chinese private sector, we really love you, you just really haven't understood our hugs in the way we intended them, to me suggests that there is a problem because the private sector has been the vehicle in the Chinese economy which has created all the new jobs and most of the economic growth for the last 10 years.
Now, the main policy lever, whenever the Chinese government wanted to keep the economy or give the economy a new boost, was infrastructure investment. At least over the past 15 years, that was the lever they chose. You mentioned the debt buildup we've seen in the past 10 years. Have they come to the conclusion that they can't play that card anymore of infrastructure investment to keep the economy going?
Yeah, the opportunity for short-term fixes has kind of exhausted itself for a couple of reasons. One, you've just mentioned, the debt overhang in the economy is now formidable. And therefore you run a problem in terms of the liquidity of banks if you have too many non-performing loans, either from construction companies or from state financial institutions or other players in the economy. Even in a closed economy, or relatively closed, with a non-convertible currency and a non-convertible capital account, this creates objective problems of liquidity within the confines of that financial system. So that's constraint number one. Then there's a basic old needs analysis. When you look at Chinese infrastructure, by and large, the biggest parts of the build have already happened. And there is still a need in terms of certain elements of residential construction for public housing. But the classical build, that we need more airports, more freeways, more high-speed rail, more broadband networks, more this, more that. If you've been doing that for 20 or 30 years, let me tell you, you get to a point where the build is pretty significant. There is better broadband now in China, in Xinjiang, than there is in most of Manhattan. And they've really done this well. Fibre optic cable right across the country. So there's the classic tools available, either on a utility ground or an indebtedness ground, are not what they used to be. So as a means of re-stimulating the economy, they are left, in my judgment, with one thing remaining. And that is to return to the script which they themselves had outlined in 2012-13 for phase 2 market-based reforms to boost productivity, to boost competition, and to therefore give much greater headroom for the Chinese private sector to do what it does best, which is create new businesses and new job opportunities and new industries.
Do you see any sign of that happening?
Well, these last statements of the last month by the political leadership, after a meeting of China's leading, I think, 100 private entrepreneurs. I was talking to one of them last week who attended the meeting. Is clear that this is what the Chinese party and state have concluded should now happen. What I don't know the answer to is whether the entrepreneurial class will believe them or not, because we've had effectively a go slow on the reform front for the last 3 years, and a set of policies which have preferenced SOEs rather than private firms. So the government's policy decision or policy conclusion that A, we have a problem, B, we'd better re-accelerate market reform in order to C, provide new opportunities and incentives for private firms, that much is clear. What will happen in implementation land and whether private firms believe that or not in China, I think is an open question.
Now, President Xi is in terms of his personal authority that he has and that he shows, in terms of his sense of national mission, he's certainly extraordinary right now. Many people refer to him as the CEE, the chief executive of everything in China. Do you see the risk that he, in the end, bit off more than he can chew?
I think there are two answers to that. One is, what's his actual control of political power now? And this is always a difficult question for foreigners to answer because the system is still opaque, Chinese political system. And then the second question is how big is the emerging criticism of him that he has gone too far? The Chinese expression which I hear a lot is 太过分了, which is just gone too far, overreached it. It's a kind of nice Chinese phrase which sort of captures it. But on the first point, what's his actual hold on political power? We often forget in the West that China is a Leninist state run by an authoritarian party which holds power through the barrel of a gun. So it's still like that. Therefore, the key question is who has the guns? Now, it's therefore who controls the security services, who controls the intelligence services, who controls the army? And there are institutions within that. Who has the control over the Wuzhuangjingcha? Who has the control over the relevant Beijing garrison of the Jundui? And who has the control over the Gong'an and the Guo'an, the two major instruments of intelligence? And the answer is Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping. Because on two sets of occasions now, he's flipped the leadership of those institutions since coming to power 5.5 years ago. So on that conventional level of analysis, his personalised control over the instruments of, shall I say, coercive power within the structure is formidable. And I haven't seen an analysis which suggests other than that from people who follow this more closely than I do. Then the second point is, okay, let's just assume he's politically rock solid. How much criticism, however, is there of him? Again, we can't, because of the opacity of the system, easily answer that. But there's enough kicking around the edges of the Chinese political debate to cause us to conclude that there is some criticism. At one extreme, we have this remonstrance from an academic from Tsinghua University, Xu Guangru, who is currently on extended leave in Tokyo and may be there for quite some time to come because of the nature of his polemic against Xi Jinping's authoritarianism. But that's out there. In London, you would just say that this person comes from the Chinese chattering classes. That is, he's kind of out there, reads the Guardian newspaper, provides a rolling commentary on what everyone else should be doing, but has no political power. Okay, but it's out there, and people talk about it. And then inside of that, you have other criticism. There's an interesting speech the other day by the son of Deng Xiaoping, Deng Pufang, the chap in a wheelchair who was thrown out of a 5-story building during the Cultural Revolution and was made into a paraplegic. He came out with a speech which reinforced the wisdom of his father's original doctrine of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Tao Guangyang Hui, Jue Bu Dang Tou. And this was an indirect criticism of those who have decided to be much more, to use the Chinese term, 分发有为, activist in their foreign policy direction. And then there are those closer in to the political establishment who have questioned the wisdom of poking the American bear too much too early in the South China Sea over the BRI, too many exercises militarily with the Russians, etc. So do these criticisms exist? Yes. Is there evidence that any of them have acquired any sharp political momentum to the point that it would cause Xi Jinping to be replaced or for his powers to be cut? I see no evidence of that.
Now, if I had to name the project that Xi Jinping has banked on in terms of projecting China's position in the world, in terms of economics, it's probably the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
I thought you were going to say Credit Suisse. No, it was a joke. Don't worry. Don't want to offend anyone here from Credit Suisse.
Now the BRI has obviously it touches all the way into Europe, but it has run into some roadblocks lately. Some of the enthusiasm around it has kind of faded away a bit. What do you make of the BRI today? Is it a game-changing project with really long-term effects, or is it still mainly a stunt?
Well, it's two interesting polarities you've given me there. It's either Abbott and Costello or it's Shakespeare. So I'm reminded in my answer of Zhou Enlai's supposed response to the question, what is the impact of the French Revolution, to which he said, too early to tell. So let's go to what's the idea behind the BRI? What are the domestic Chinese constraints and opportunities? And then thirdly, how's the world reacting, or how's Asia reacting so far? The idea behind it is both geoeconomic and geopolitical and partly commercial, and probably in that order. The geoeconomic strategy is to cause the Eurasian landmass to become fundamentally to cause the Eurasian landmass to have China as its principal economic partner over time, and thereby through that obtain geopolitical influence, whereby that vast array of countries will not be hostile to China's core national interests. And secondly, both geoeconomically and commercially, through its rollout of telecommunications networks and products as well, and broadband systems, to cause Chinese products and service lines to become standard provision, and the standards associated with them to become increasingly international and then universal, rather than American standards, if you know what I mean. And then at a purely commercial level, it's, hang on, we've overbuilt the country domestically, we've got a whole bunch of people in the construction industry, how do we actually provide alternative and additional forms of corporate and employment engagement? We'll build $2 trillion worth of infrastructure offshore. So that, in aggregate, is the wide strategic concept. When people say it's one or the other, and it's only this or that, if you read the literature, it's all of the above, in one level, to one level or another. The second point is, so what about the implementation? In China at present, we at the Asia Society Policy Institute have been trying for the last 6 months to produce a policy paper on how is this thing organised? Like, what's the command structure? What's the decision-making process? What are the projects? How much are they funded? What's the equity arrangement in project X and country Y, etc.? Where China suffers enormously is the absence of transparency on the above. So if we try to collect the data, we actually can't find it. It's difficult. What we hear and understand is that when you aggregate everything that's been said by various public exponents of the BRI, it ranges between $1 and $3 trillion worth of investment projects across a band of 70 to 72 countries, across Eurasia into Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, and across to East Africa. And in its more recent formulations, anywhere you happen to point to in the world, where apparently there were also silk routes, but we just haven't discovered the original navigators yet, including some to Chile, apparently. Interesting. But here's the constraint, is that there's a lot of cash involved in that. China, in its own internal discourse, is finally realising that it's not made of cash. Ultimately, it has to come from somewhere. And if you look at China's total foreign reserves, they're in the vicinity of 3 to 4 trillion. And questions are being asked in the internal debate, is it really wise to be funding this vast number of projects in this vast number of countries when the likely financial rate of return is somewhere between 0 and -10? I mean, ask yourself the question, if these were such good projects, why weren't they invested in by a whole bunch of other people beforehand in the international investment community? So there's a debate emerging in China along the lines of the question, Chairman Xi, is this entirely wise? So that's one constraint. Finally, there's the foreign reaction. Now, the Americans like to console themselves by saying this is all going terribly badly for China. What we pick up in our analyses is that it's a really mixed picture across the world. Some projects in some countries seem to be going okay in terms of receptiveness by foreign governments and, in fact, local community buy-in. Others, like you've seen recently with the transfer of ownership of the port in Sri Lanka from the Sri Lankan authorities to the Chinese state-owned enterprise concerned, because Sri Lanka can't service the debt that they've engineered for themselves, have led to a reverse reaction in countries across South Asia, for example. But it's mixed. So I think it's far too early for the Americans to think about claiming victory in all of this. And of course, the Americans ultimately have a problem. The Chinese may have $500 billion, $1 trillion, $3 trillion actually or potentially on the table. The Americans currently have $1.75 because they've cut the aid budget, they've slashed the State Department, and there's no equivalent investment vehicle for funding infrastructure investment anywhere in the G77. So ultimately, if you're sitting in Tanzania and Kenya at the moment and you're asking, well, we want to develop a high-quality port, am I going to go to the United States? No. Will I go to the Chinese? Well, maybe. That's kind of where we stand.
Now, in terms of the relationship between China and Europe, what we see often under the banner of the BRI, Beijing picks off individual countries in Eastern Europe, be it the Czech Republic, be it Hungary, and so on. And some people say, well, they don't want to deal on an EU-wide level with Europe, but they want to divide the individual members of the European Union. How do you, from your vantage point, analyze China's strategy towards Europe?
Well, I think China's global strategy is to deal with individual states on direct commercial negotiations, because China, consistent with its own strategic literature of the last 2,500 years, has learnt that. If you read the Sun Tzu Bingfa, the art of war, about how you deal with the rest of the world, it's not about, let's wait for all of our potential partners to form a union against us with whom we have to negotiate. I know we go for the weakest link and we'll go there first. So it's as alive in the Sun Tzu Art of War documents as it is in Machiavelli in terms of basic strategic opportunism in an entirely realist frame. So we shouldn't be too shocked by this reality. I seem to remember various European states practicing similar politics at various different stages of history as well. But when I observe what's happening in Southeast Asia, in the ASEANs, for example, the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the weak link there is Cambodia, which has long been a large-scale recipient of Chinese both development assistance and infrastructure investment. The net consequence of which is Cambodia has, from time to time, been deliberately obstructive in ASEAN reaching common positions in dealing with China on a range of matters, including South China Sea negotiations. If you look at the European Union, China quite some time ago became particularly active in foreign direct investments and other forms of economic assistance in Greece. Greece, under the current government, has been from time to time reluctant to side with the rest of the European Union on common human rights positions levelled against China. In terms of the former Eastern Europe, you spoke of the Czech Republic. That has been a particular focus of Chinese foreign direct investment activity. The consequences of that behaviour vis-à-vis Czech positions on European policy, I'm not sufficiently familiar with what the Czech Republic has done. But certainly there's an element of all of that. At the same time, China does fashion its own institutional engagements with various groupings in a +1 formula. ASEAN +1 is the 10 Southeast Asians plus the Chinese on broader consultative but not commercial arrangements. In Eastern Europe, I think it's called 16 +1 from memory. With the Latins, it's X +1 in Latin America. And so there is a certain symmetry to this, which is we'll have a foreign policy collaborative arrangement with 16 +1, similarly with Africa, 50 or 53 +1. But on a commercial basis, it's me plus the government of Ethiopia.
Here in Europe and also in Switzerland, one of the main focal points in the discussion were Chinese purchases of companies, private enterprises, Syngenta, for example, here in Switzerland, which were being bought by state-owned enterprises in China. In Germany, there's been a big political discussion about that, also here in Switzerland, and we were trying to find out how should we deal with that? How should we deal with this strategic movement of the Chinese state into our economies? Should we allow that, or should we have a CFIUS type of strategic board that decides whether that should be allowed or not? How did you do that in Australia?
Well, Australia has always been a capital importing country for historical reasons. There's 25 million of us. We occupy the 6th largest piece of real estate in the world. And you want to build some infrastructure, it's bloody expensive. And so, therefore, to develop our national economy, we've relied on waves and waves of FDI going back to the days of the British Empire. So firstly, there was the Brits, followed by the Americans, followed by the Japanese, followed by the Koreans, and most recently the Chinese. And so our response to each wave of investment has usually been a little bit of initial paranoia, followed by a process to evaluate each individual investment application above a certain dollar threshold. Fortunately, our predecessors back in 1976 established something called the Foreign Investment Review Board, bipartisan legislation, way before there was any significant flows of Chinese foreign investment. And that mandated that on any significant investment proposal in whichever sector of the economy, that it would go through a mandatory, quote, national interest test, which enabled you to get inside as regulators the architecture of any proposed deal in terms of where the money's coming from, what are the corporation's plans for the asset they're about to acquire, and the impact on the local economy as well. And we have applied that to both private investments and to SOE investments over time. For example, there was an attempt by Royal Dutch Shell to purchase a very large Australian resources company, where we simply said, no, doesn't suit our interests. Why just contribute to a bigger monopoly in that particular sector already owned by Royal Dutch Shell? Fortunately, also in 1976, they established a clause in our Act to cover SOEs. there were no SOEs investing anywhere in the world from China in those days. There was the odd Romanian SOE, which is why I think our predecessors thought long and hard ahead about how you would handle this. So we therefore, in this wave of Chinese investment, which started in about the year 2005, so we've been dealing with this for about a decade and a half now in Australia, have one by one sifted these things through. Now on the SOE test, what we've had to do is unpack the precise ownership structure, so that if it's an SOE, then who is the S? Is it your average Chinese pension fund, or is it the Ministry of State Security through some other intermediary? And these are important analytical questions to arrive at a conclusion on. Secondly, we ask, what's the history of this SOE's impact on market distortionary behaviour? Because we believe in open markets, as I'm sure you do here in Switzerland, and therefore we don't want to buy someone who's going to be either monopolistic or monopsonistic in their behaviour. That is, using their purchasing power to set effectively wider prices for the economy or even the global economy. So there have been big projects which we've rejected. Chinalco wanted to buy Rio Tinto, the second largest resources company in the world. So my government said, nah, gone. Did the Chinese like it? No, they attacked me personally in the Chinese official language media, saying that it was racist. So I responded robustly, and after a while they just shut up. We also said no to Huawei becoming a major provider in the the Australian broadband network. And we did that on national security grounds. Chinese objected to that, called me racist again, and my response was, we would like our own national telecommunications companies in Australia to take up significant equity in the Chinese broadband network. How about that? Silence from the Chinese. That was the end of that debate, because they didn't want to do it for national security reasons. But we ended up approving about 85% of inbound investment proposals. But we did subject these significant ones to extensive tests. They became controversial. And so it's not for me to tell the Swiss Confederation what to do, or the Germans. But frankly, in our experiences, it is absolutely normal to go through a CFIUS type process. The Australian Foreign Investment Review Board predates CFIUS, and we've been doing it for a long time with investors other than Chinese investors. And it helps basically manage domestic political opinion within our own country when we eventually approve something on a particular project, which may be controversial, but which doesn't offend domestic competition policy, doesn't offend national security grounds, because we don't want to take any decisions which are going to be perceived in any way as being racist.
The official Swiss position in these matters was always, we're an open economy, we're a liberal economy, it's okay if anyone wants to buy a Swiss company, but we would like to have reciprocity. Same with China.
Don't hold your breath.
Do you see that happening on the horizon anywhere?
Not if China can get away with it. China, in my experience, is kind of smiles to itself, the extent to which the rest of us allow it to get away with certain behaviours, including the non-reciprocal treatment of inbound investment. I've raised this when the Chinese have objected to the things that I rejected. As soon as I go into the media and say, and reciprocal treatment in China is what? It shuts down the debate immediately. But it's not yielded a more flexible Chinese inbound investment environment until very recently. We see various decisions by the Chinese authorities to allow dominant or 100% equity for financial institutions now to be established in China or in parts of China. But my friends in the finance community tell me that once you go to the fine text and look at the conditionalities for your ability to operate freely and openly as a freestanding foreign-owned financial institution in China, again, don't hold your breath in terms of your ability to do everything, because the behind-the-border regulatory impediments are still significant. So this is where it'll be interesting as to where Trump ends up in his full frontal assault on inequitable treatment, both in the traded economy and in the investment economy as well. Open question as to how much it will liberalise. From China's domestic point of view, the smartest thing it could do would be to open its borders to large-scale, inbound foreign investment, particularly in its non-performing sectors. The Chinese financial system is notoriously inefficient. It's a bad allocator of financial capital because it's so administratively driven as opposed to the business cases involved. And so China would benefit enormously from a highly competitive finance sector. It would help drive its economy forward. The more it protects it, the worse its financial sector gets.
Now, Switzerland has a history of very early engagement with China. Its official recognition of the People's Republic, the first private joint venture. In your view, and I know you're not giving advice to the Swiss government, but in your view, tiny Switzerland, how can it play its cards wisely in dealing with China?
Well, the first instance is don't regard yourselves as tiny. I mean, Switzerland's a very successful country, and you've managed your global public relations as a country really well. When our Chinese friends look at Europe, I think in their lens of successful economies, and up there at the top of the pile is Germany. And they marvel at what Germany has done, particularly in the period of post-war reconstruction, and they marvel particularly at the global competitiveness of German industrial firms, manufacturing enterprises, and the capacity for Germans to innovate within industry and create next-generation technology, which is why there's obviously such a huge state-driven focus by Chinese firms to go and take over middle-ranking German firms. But then there is, I'd say, a second group of European economies where the Chinese also have deep regard, and that's yourself and the Swedes, because you've sustained high levels of industrial competitiveness. You have a highly efficient and international financial services sector driven by classic brands, and you know who they are. And at the same time, you've managed to hold on to other brands, in dairy and bloody chocolate and all that stuff, And so they look at you guys as Swiss and they say, they're pretty smart, these guys. So my second piece of advice, and I'd say the same to the Swedes, with whom I've had discussions as well, in private and public forum, is don't undersell yourselves. I mean, this may not be the largest economy in the world, but it is a highly competitive and globalised economy, like the Swedes. And there's 10 million Swedes, there's 8 million Swiss, depending on how you count your population. And they see you, therefore, as a significant economy. So when you push back, understand that you are doing so from a position of reputational strength. The last thing I think our Chinese friends would want would be for Switzerland, given its role in the international financial community, to take a systemically negative view of what China is doing in the world. And so therefore you bring assets to the table in terms of which projects you accept and under what circumstances matter for you folks, and the slightly riotous democracy you have here in Switzerland across all your cantons and referendums and God knows whatever else.